So, back in January 2026, this old, kind of absurd idea suddenly came roaring back to life and almost kicked off a massive trade war. We're talking about President Donald Trump's push for Greenland. And let's be clear, he didn't just want to buy it, he was pretty much demanding it. This was never about a simple real estate deal. No, this was a huge geopolitical power play, all about the future of the Arctic, and it's tangled up in big questions of strategy, sovereignty, and of course, national security. And the stage for all this? The World Economic Forum in Davos. You know, a place that's usually all about careful, diplomatic language. Well, President Trump was having none of that. He brought back his old 2019 proposal, but this time with a much more aggressive, much sharper edge. He demanded immediate negotiations and basically framed buying the world's largest island as a matter of urgent global security, not a suggestion, an imperative. Okay, so how on earth did this escalate so fast? Here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the proposal itself. Then we're going to unpack the real strategy behind it. What was really going on? After that, we'll dive into the tense diplomatic standoff it created and the mysterious framework deal that was supposed to fix everything. And finally, we'll look at the huge question mark this whole thing leaves hanging over the Arctic's future. All right, let's jump right in with the proposal itself. Now, the idea of the U.S. buying Greenland, it actually wasn't brand new. President Trump had floated it way back in 2019, but, and this is the key part, when he brought it back in 2026, the entire tone had shifted. It went from being a kind of off-the-cuff suggestion to a full-blown demand. So picture this. We're at Davos, surrounded by world leaders, and Trump doesn't just suggest buying Greenland, he straight up demands talks. His whole argument was that Denmark, even though they're a NATO ally, just wasn't capable of properly defending such a massive territory. He painted it as a major security vulnerability for the entire Western Hemisphere. So right from the start, this wasn't pitched as a business deal. It was framed as an absolute security imperative. So you might be asking yourself, why the sudden urgency? What was the big deal? A lot of people's minds went straight to Greenland's massive untapped mineral wealth. You know, rare earth minerals and all that. But the Trump administration was really quick to shut that down. They insisted, nope, the main reason isn't resources. It's all about strategy. And this quote right here, it really gets to the heart of the administration's argument. The thinking went something like this. Geographically, Greenland is part of the North American continent. So they started framing it as our territory, not in a political sense, but in a continental one. The argument was that its defense was therefore a U.S. responsibility, especially with Russia and China becoming more and more active up in the Arctic. Now, to try and strengthen his case, President Trump also made this pretty bold historical claim. He said that the U.S. basically controlled Greenland during World War II and then made a huge mistake by giving it back. The thing is, the actual history is a bit different. The U.S. did step in and set up bases to defend Greenland after Denmark was occupied by Germany, which was absolutely crucial. But it never actually held sovereignty over the island. It was acting as a protector, not an owner. But, you know, setting aside the rhetoric for a second, Greenland's strategic value is absolutely real, and it has been for a long, long time. I mean, the U.S. has operated the Patuxent Space Base there since the Cold War, and that's a critical spot for our missile early warning systems. Plus, the island sits right on top of the shortest air and sea routes between North America and Europe. It's basically a gatekeeper to the North Atlantic. For decades, the fundamental U.S. priority has been super simple. Don't let any rival power, like Russia or China, get a military foothold there, period. So, you can probably guess how this whole demand went over in Europe, right? Yeah, not well at all. Denmark's rejection was swift and forceful, and that just set the stage for a really fast, really dangerous escalation that dragged the entire continent into the fight. And just like that, things went from a diplomatic disagreement to a full-blown crisis. As all these key European allies started lining up behind Denmark, the Trump administration's response wasn't more diplomacy. It was economic hardball, a threat of massive tariffs on 8 different countries. And this wasn't just about twisting Denmark's arm anymore. This was a direct challenge to the entire European Union. I mean, it's wild how fast this all unfolded. The tariff threat drops on January 17th, and the EU immediately goes into crisis mode. But then, just 4 days later, there's this big meeting in Davos, and boom, the White House does a complete 180. They pull the tariffs back and announce that they've reached some kind of breakthrough deal. But make no mistake, the European response was totally unified and completely defiant. This quote from Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, "Europe won't be blackmailed," really summed up the mood perfectly. Leaders all across the continent were sending a crystal clear message. We will not be bullied into negotiating away the sovereignty of one of our allies. So, what on earth happened in that meeting to make everything change so suddenly? Well, that brings us to this thing called the Framework Deal. It was the agreement announced at Davos that, yes, stopped the immediate crisis, but it also left pretty much everybody scratching their heads with way more questions than answers. And that really is the central mystery of this whole affair. What exactly was this framework deal? I mean, it was announced by President Trump and the head of NATO, but the official statement was, well, it was incredibly vague. It seemed almost intentionally so, and it left allies and analysts everywhere just scrambling to figure out what, if anything, had actually been decided. Okay, so here's what we do know for sure. We know the deal put top U.S. officials like the VP and the Secretary of State in charge of future talks. Super important. It took that big tariff threat off the table. It also included a promise from President Trump that he wouldn't use military force. And the official focus seemed to shift away from buying Greenland outright and more towards modernizing the old 1951 defense agreement with Denmark and just talking about Arctic security in general. But the list of what we don't know? Oh, it's way, way longer. Like, is this a real deal with actual commitments, or was it just a clever way for everyone to save face and walk away? There's no public timeline for any of these negotiations. And maybe the biggest question of all, what's Greenland's actual role in talks about, well, about its own future? And yeah, the biggest unknown is whether some kind of sovereignty transfer, even a symbolic one, is still secretly on the table. So one potential solution that's been floated is this idea of a sovereign base area. Think of it as a kind of compromise. Instead of the U.S. buying the entire island, Denmark would grant the United States full ownership, legal sovereignty, over small, very specific pieces of land, like the area right around the Pacific Space Base. It would be a way for the U.S. to get that permanent military presence at once, without having to take over the whole territory. But, and this is a huge but, for the people of Greenland, any of these discussions are a complete non-starter if they're not at the table. This quote from Aja Chemnitz-Larsen, a Greenlandic member of parliament, became a powerful rallying cry. Nothing about us without us. Their position is crystal clear. Their voice has to be front and center in any negotiation about their home. So, after all that drama, where does that leave us? Well, the immediate crisis, the threat of a trade war, that's over. But the fundamental disagreement over Greenland's future, and really the future security of the entire Arctic, that is far, far from resolved. Right now, we're in a tense but talking phase. The threats are gone, but the negotiations are on. The U.S. is still pushing for more military access, a more permanent foothold, all in the name of security. At the same time, Denmark and Greenland are holding a very firm red line. They're saying that any transfer of sovereignty, the actual ultimate authority over their land, is completely off the table. It's a line they will not cross. And really, this whole Greenland Gambit forces all of us to look at a new reality. As the Arctic continues to change, as the ice melts, the old rules about territory and sovereignty are being seriously tested. So you have to wonder, was this whole episode just a bizarre one-off diplomatic fight? Or is it the first real sign of a future where strategic location becomes more important than national borders? The answer to that question, well, it's going to define the next chapter of the great game in the High North.